Morning, everyone. So I think we're going to get started. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Right. So thank you very much for coming to our talk on twisting the screw the other way, legitimising EAP differently. Before we start the paper in earnest, I'm going to give a little bit of a genesis of this talk. And there are many geneses of this talk, some of which are appropriate to talk about here and others aren't. But it is all to do with legitimisation and who is legitimate to speak. It's kind of how I got to know Letitia through a very interesting incident. But one of the... Right. Yeah, we could talk about that. But anyway, it's nothing too weird or inappropriate. But what we did start thinking about right at the beginning of the origin of this work, which goes back 2.5 years maybe, was thinking about, okay, so if we had to map the field of EAP, and we started thinking about who has symbolic power, which agents in the field can change things, where do we sit in that? We came up with this sort of Cartesian plane. And if you're familiar with LCT, you'll probably think we're going to be talking about LCT. We're not. Cartesian planes predate LCT by quite a few centuries. So, but it gave us the opportunity to sort of start mapping out what would be the coordinates that you would use to sort of signify different agents and what they can impact on the field and so on. And that drew us to conducting a study where we wanted to understand the field of practice of EAP, not the discipline. Got us thinking about what methods we could use, how we could approach that. So our talk today is really about 2.5 years of work on this. So we went from that to looking at a socio-analysis of the field. Now, socio-analysis is drawing on Bourdieu and this idea of metanoia, which I can't say properly. Thank you. And it's the basic impulse that Bourdieu has, where we would like to think that operating a socio-analysis enables a transformation of how we see the field of EAP, to repudiate past practices and doxas, so to begin to unthink some of the things we take for granted within the field, to adopt a new gaze. So operating with Bourdieu allows you to see things quite differently in terms of agents, in terms of structure, and so on. And what we're trying to do is break with something called illusio, which sounds like something from Harry Potter, but in a lot of things with Bourdieu do, which he defines as the enchanted circle of collective denial. Okay, which is a nice thing. It's the things that we just take for granted, we assume, etc. Illusio can also be equated with investment in some ways. So we're deliberately operating a kind of rhetorical strategy of twisting the screw the other way, which is, again, an expression that Bourdieu has, but he borrowed it rather provocatively from Mao, German Mao. So the idea is twisting the screw the other way. Sorry?
I didn't know that.
Well, sorry. Sorry, you wouldn't have agreed to it otherwise, but anyway. That's for Too late now. So, yeah. And the idea is that if you look at Bourdieu, a lot of his work is deliberately reductive, and it is to emphasize a truth very strongly. So it's to bring to light the kinds of things that we tend to ignore. So that, you'll probably come out of here thinking that it's not quite true what we're saying, or it's a bit strong. But there's a deliberate rhetorical reason for doing that. Okay, so what is a socio-analysis? This is where things get a little bit complex but interesting. The primary focus in socio-analysis is looking at the field EAP and not the agents. Agents operate within the field, but they're only interesting because they exist in the field. So the characteristics of any field are a structured social space, contains agents, which means institutions too, who dominate and who are dominated. The field is a permanent relationship of inequality. Field agents struggle to transform or preserve the field, so you get orthodoxy and heterodoxy in the field. All agents harness the powers they have in this struggle, whatever they have, different combinations of capital, and power defines agents' position in the field and their strategies. So what we're able to do in the field depends on the combined resources that we have. That's basically Bourdieu's definition of a field. Okay. So if you came to Ian's talk that I did with him yesterday, and many of you didn't, so it's not really relevant, but we had the same... Sorry. We looked at this, and with Ian and I, we were looking at the relationship between genre and discourse, epistemology disciplines, and disciplinary cultures. What we've been looking at, I mean, with Letitia, is where the field of EAP sits within higher education and in relation to these domains. So our focus is on the middle bit. Now, what we're talking about today is part of a chapter that we've written in a book we've edited, Practitioner Agency and Identity in English for Academic Purposes. There are a lot of different accounts of structure and agency in there, in very different contexts. So this is a work that's taken 2.5 years to do. It's also going to lead to a book we're writing, so a lot of the ideas we've got from this work has been very generative to produce other things. And it's on reconfiguring language in higher education, social justice, ethics and practices, which again is, we hopefully going to be provocative, I think. Yeah, okay, thanks.
Checking the titles now.
Yeah, so it's been very, very fruitful kind of pieces of work that we've been doing. EAP is not a typical field. When Bourdieu had fields in mind, he's thinking of scientific fields that are very autonomous in relation to external agents or capitalism or other things. So scientific field is supposed to be relatively autonomous from outside influence. EAP is not like that. And in fact, most academic disciplines now are not like that at all. But EAP we've defined as ill-defined, so the boundaries are porous. They're ill-guaranteed but open and full of potential, as the phrase goes. Leaves their occupants the possibility of defining them by bringing the embodied necessity which is constitutive of the habitus. This is all a bit complex. Their future depends on what is made of them by their occupants, or at least those of them who in the struggles with the profession and in confrontations with neighbouring and rival professions manage to impose the definition of the profession most favourable to what they are. Now, this is very hard work, but essentially, there's a lot at stake in EAP. There's a lot up for grabs. It's a porous field. We have private institutions that try to encroach on our territory. We have librarians who do the same. We have big testing groups. So the field is not self-contained. So a lot is at stake. And because it's ill-defined, because entry to it is very difficult or odd or obscure, there are no credentials that we need particularly. So it's not like a traditional profession in that respect. So we set up with trying to understand what this ill-defined field is through a set of research questions and a survey.
Okay, we'll take over. Okay, so these are the research questions we set out to answer. Today we're just going to touch on a little bit of one and a little bit of two. No, a little bit of three, I think. So of course it's we collected a lot of data and it's taking quite. So we can only touch on a little bit. The first thing was with socio-analysis was to go back to really the beginning, the foundational type of stories of the field, what Bourdieu calls the narrative of origin. And to do this, what was quite interesting is that Alex was bringing a lot of knowledge about Bourdieu, and I was really interested in critical discourse analysis, using a bit of SFL to see if we can use this to operationalize Bourdieu. I mean, Bourdieu's perspective on language is in many ways quite similar to SFL. It's a complex relation, but seeing language as key to symbolic representation or as a main mediator in social reproduction, seeing language as a social action is common to the two. But of course, Bourdieu doesn't have a linguistic apparatus to look at phenomenon. It just stops at very superficial kind of linguistic markers. This is a quote I really like from Bourdieu, and to me it means something very similar that SFL means. And so from SFL, we found that transitivity, for example, is very interesting to use, appraisal from Martin and White, social actors theory as well from Van Leeuwen, to look at how actors are represented or erased. This is the data we use, so that first part was quite inspired by Bourdieu, some publicly available texts. We used the BALEAP website, UEFAP, I don't know how you pronounce this acronym. Some publications, blogs, even obituaries, pieces, and then some of you, I think, in this room probably indulged us with the longest questionnaire ever written. I did tell him that's too long, and he went, yes, fine. So, but I mean, it was really exciting to read all of that. There's so much, like there's a big amount of questions that we didn't even start looking at. But it was, yeah, so thank you very much for doing that. It was very, very interesting and insightful. So we're going to start with, I'll go back to this slide just to say that the idea of illusio we organize into the agents, knowledge, and the pedagogy. We're not going to talk about pedagogy today, but a bit about the agents, a bit about knowledge. So the first thing to look at is those narratives of origin. So we're starting to twist the screw here. Okay, so the pressure for me is rising. So those words come from Bourdieu, right? It's nothing to do with us. But he talks about high priest, missionaries. I'm not sure, that might be us. But anyway, so Bourdieu analyzed his own field, right? Philosophy, ethnography, sociology, and didn't make any friends, I think, by doing that. But I think we're in a fairly safe environment. That was perfect, the theme of this conference. Anyway, so the idea is that those initial stories have framed our understanding. Our habitus is shaped by this collective memory. And so if we look at the early days of the field and how the actors there are represented, it tells us a lot about the values that were built around the practitioner. So again, we use those types of, that type of data, and we found three main narratives of legitimation. The first one is practitioner's mobility. So here, Bartlett's circumstance of place and time for the lexical grammar level, which we found really matched the what Pennycook called the expansionist rhetoric. So when we looked at those texts, invariably the practitioners' names are surrounded by long inventories of countries, many of them post-colonial. And it's not just that, it's also all of the motifs around it. There's economic and cultural motifs, like companies and cultural phrases, and also something that I personally find quite quaint, a sort of very quaint lexis around things like cutting your teeth or someone's Libyan period. So we were always like laughing quite a lot about having images of people with pith helmets and stuff. Anyway, so this was also a very interesting finding from Abbott and Jordan. So obviously two very, very well established people in our field. And this is a book they published about their own experiences, so a sort of autobiography. And that really reminded me of what Pennycook did with Paul Theroux Bryson and Crystal's talk about how English is unbeatable, but I really feel like I'm a French person saying that. It's incredible. I'll have to. I'm really sorry. We are twisting the screw, that's what we're doing. Okay, so but you can see, right, the British Empire, the empire of its language flourishes, far-flung corners of the world. So that's all that kind of almost nostalgia of an old world. So that was the first narrative. The second narrative was expertise and agency. So this also was very obvious through discourse analysis that all of the agents were active. So looking just at process types or active and passive voice, the agents in the field, they use material processes to really shape the educational context in those far-flung things. They set up centres, they build educational, they consult, they advise, etc. And even if they are in a more passive position, that is usually in relation to a much more powerful institutional agents like the British Council. And we see also a nominalisation here that occurs, that's quite interesting. So further British Council postings, there's a sort of conflation of the whole mission with those agents. We saw it with Abbott and Jordan, they endorse it directly, right? This is in part because of the effort of the itinerant teachers in far-flung countries. Enjoying unexpected delights. Enduring coup and odd customs. Coup are really annoying for EAP teachers, I find. They are really annoying. Particularly for EAP teachers. Anyway. So it just kind of evokes that kind of world of a very quaint place where people with a specific, epistemic, cultural, racial, gender, often capital, tend to go and help the less fortunate, what Pennycook called linguistically deprived, and so they come to embody that idea. This is very much twisting the screw, this one. So this is what Bourdieu called the collusion in the illusio. So it's a sort of deep-rooted complicity in the collective fantasy, an exaltation of the ego, an attachment to the group as an enchanted image of the self, the idea of superior essence, and the affinities of habitus. So that kind of, this is how the group is formed, and those norms are come to exist. The third narrative that we found, and which I think is the cornerstone of the two others I don't think can exist without this one, is there's erasure of the local actors and knowledge. In those texts, right, in those really texts about the initial kind of representation of those, the professional experiences. In terms of discursive strategy, that's erasure, Stevie, I think we pronounce, talks about void or suppression. Van Leeuwen calls this suppression. So that means there is hardly any mention of local knowledge or experts beyond what we saw, beyond with the governments, with the Department of Education. There is no mention of local knowledge, expertise, scholars, practices. The rare ones that we found were really as deficits, so the need for foreign experts because there aren't any local ones. So this erasure of local agents has obviously very strong impact on how they can be envisaged, how they envisage themselves, how they build any type of agency, and basically whether they are heard or not. And you can imagine, of course that this kind of narrative is perceived very differently from practitioners originating from the countries themselves. So, of course, that we've seen today and in the last 2 days, and with quite a lot of publications, of course things are very different, are changing. This was the old days, but still there's quite a bit that is difficult to shake off. So there are loads of positive. The narratives now are a lot more around professionalization, scholarship, and so on. So it's very hard for those narratives to still be comfortably expressed. But still, as we've also discussed in the last few days, it pops up quite often. The BALEAP mailing list is quite a nice example of that. This was from Dean Bon and Bruce, and it was quoting someone from 2011, so it's a few years back, but still, I mean, you can see the utter delusion in pretending that outside of the UK we're very likely to find English teachers who are unqualified or poorly qualified. It is an example of a sort of delusion. We also find jobs in faraway countries being still constructed as it's not ideal, but it's part of my professional trajectory, so again, no mention of local context. And we still find the global north expert in leadership positions, or the non-representing panels, and etc. So I think it's really important to look at representation. So how are the different agents in the field represented? Are they included? Are they consequential? Are they just props in somebody else's negotiation of their own position in the field? It's really important to look at how the discourse does that, because it has direct influences on the material world. So it might not change the world to look at language carefully, but at least it can help lift the illusion. So I'll go back to this to go into knowledge very quickly. So our focus is on agents, but what's actually really important is the consequence it has, on what we do in the classroom and how we understand the field. So, of course, Pennycook has written about this. There's, the myth around ELT, English is very simple, superior for thinking. Tupas and Renandia talked about the monolingual fallacy. So that idea that we should only have English in the classroom. This one is my pet hate, the critical period hypothesis, which is, obviously anchored in nativeness, and is, I think, debunked for its validity, but certainly for what it aims to achieve, which is native-like proficiency. But you can see how this supported the whole ELT industry throughout the young learner industry. I think it links, but this is something we're working on, but it links to a lack of clarity around language ontology. This working hand in hand with what we've seen about erasing the local knowledge means that over decades it has legitimized and empowered thousands of monolingual Anglophone teachers around the world, because those narratives were there to build a legitimacy. This is Alex phrasing the zombie-like persistence of the portrayal of the multi-bilingual teacher of EAP as lacking, deficient, struggling, agentless. And unfortunately, sadly, even in very well-meaning research, do we really need endless amount of poor non-native teacher? You're struggling so much. We could write something about monolingual Anglo teachers. You must be struggling a lot. No. That's that kind of just let's maybe stop talking too much about it, because I know I have some friends who are non-native speakers here. They're native speakers of their own language. I don't think we kind of feel this is a terrible impediment. If you guys would stop reminding us, it might just be perfectly fine. Crucially, I think, is that idea of the imagination around what we can do in the curriculum, how deep we can go with students, what we can talk about. I think all this is kind of very limited by people with that ideology that is very restricted, right? So, okay, now we're getting to the survey. So we asked practitioners, capitals, influences, their values, their ethics. So we're now very positively moving away from this sad state of affair with those old narratives. The legitimate capitals that were mostly mentioned were professional experience. So we asked, how do we progress in the field? Professional experience, qualifications, scholarship. Very interestingly, multilingualism came up as well. Many people were really, really happy to say, I'm bilingual, I like to talk. So there's definitely a shift that this actually becomes an important capital for us. The influences, so that made us laugh, obviously, because obviously our sample reflects this, but we had obviously the high priests, always at the top of the list. There's one high priest, but I hope he's not here. That's okay. So anyway, those people were still obviously, of course, hugely influential. But suddenly, in between, we had people, that we're not used to seeing. Like Susie, I think you were in between Suresh Karaja and Bell Hooks or something. Good company. So it was very odd to see this because, of course, we sent the survey through the BALEAP mail list and Alex through Twitter. So, of course, we understand these are... But this is also the field. So we're not going to talk about representativeness, but it is the field the way it is. You answered those questions, and it's probably significant of a few, a sizable population here. And it made us think about the bibliometric studies, the Highland and Jiang, for example, where, of course, there is no practitioner at all, because the bibliometric kind of looks at the influence of researchers on researchers. So it was really kind of interesting to see that our work kind of is starting, I don't mean our own, I mean practitioners' work is starting to really impact what we're doing. I think just because we do interesting things. And this is from someone we just said, we reach a point of saturation. It doesn't mean we don't like it, but we are pressed for time. We're teaching quite a lot, so when we read stuff, maybe we need to...
Time.
Sorry. Okay. Ethical concerns that was really, I think, quite different, right? From we had diverse representation, more ethics in scholarship, calls for better employment conditions, better treatment. So I'm really sorry that I'm really collapsing this in one slide. There's a lot more, and we will develop. You're not doing that.
No, I'm not.
I've been still found some kind of, not problematic, but still there's obviously a lot of work to do. So still some mentions of problematic dichotomies like scholarship versus teaching skills, knowledge of language ontology, assumptions around pragmatism and criticality, and so, a few things that still we need to work through to kind of clarify and leave behind. A few, okay, I'll just go. Yes, influences. So although there's a call for better representation, the influences were still very much global north. Okay, and ethics seemed to be for others to practice, but I think that was also part of how we phrased the question.
We've kind of run through this probably a lot quicker than we would have liked, but we also know that we have a captive audience and you've got other things to go to. But I wanted to finish with this idea of anamnesis, which is a word I discovered. I want to divide the kind of the history of EAP and interest in the practitioners into two distinct historical periods. Pre-Greg Hadley and post-Greg Hadley. Greg Hadley wrote a book about EAP managers in 2015. And prior to that, any surfacing of concerns around the practitioner were very ephemeral, very fleeting, very marginal. He was the first person to bring to light the kind of existential problems that practitioners are having. So his book was extremely important. And he used this phrase called professional disarticulation. Disarticulation is a kind of butchering term which you don't want to look up on Google, but it's essentially a dismembering, this sense of being dissonant, disjointed, that the world doesn't fit your expectations or your investments. So his book was the first book that was orientated towards the practitioner field. So this idea of amnesis is a recalling or recollection or bringing forth, bringing into the public domain. So from that moment onwards, we've seen a whole series of practitioner contributions about their identity, their status, their existential value. All of these kind of things are now fairly common. They're not a majority concern, but they're part of our discourse. So this kind of shift is extremely important, I think. It shows that we're in a kind of fracture with the research field of EAP, where we're beginning to be more confident about what we're doing, having our own luminaries and heretics and our own sources, our own interests that are not dictated by to be frank, a very conventional research field in EAP. I think that's very, very, very healthy. So what I think that shift indicates is from 2015, we're going through a very disjointed or very kind of individual efforts to understand the field. But through understanding the field, and this is part of the work that we've been trying to do with Ian and all sorts of other people, is this idea that if you understand the terms and conditions of operations in the field, who is legitimised, how, why, and so on, this is the beginnings of the way of being able to transform it. So the idea that social justice, what's wrong with the field, what the way that power is used, who gets legitimised, why, etc. Once you begin to understand that, then you can begin to undertake all of the questions around what do we need to do. So a lot of the work that I've done with Ian, people will come up and say, oh, that's just a really depressing piece of work, and then just walk off, or it's navel gazing, or I just want to get on with it. And there's a kind of inner fury when people do that, because it indicates a kind of self-satisfaction. It's fine for me. I'm all right. Suits me, the field. I'm doing okay out of it. And it's not. It's not. The point of writing about these things is not to depress people or to say we're all, marginal and operating on the bloody edge of academia, which is what essentially we get quoted for. It's not about kind of a nihilism. It's about, once we objectify all of that, we can begin to think, how do we accrue the kind of capitals that give us some elbow room, some agency, some control, rather than just a sort of an ephemeral, kind of marginal, morose position. So this is really what underpins what we're doing. This is what Bourdieu came up with that Cartesian plane. So you'll look forward to the one we have, and you'll be able to find yourself on there. So it gives an idea of the complexity and also how you make and lose friends in the field.
And there is only one woman on that.
Yeah.
Only one.
Yeah.
I didn't see one.
The last bit, just as a bit of fun, we asked, I can't remember exactly what the question was, but it was an image to sum up EAP, was it?
What was EAP be?
Yeah.
It was very funny. We will have to put the list. We had a kind of struggling over there, and more positive over there. Or at least, seeing the fun side.
We also had a question about. We had one question about songs, didn't we?
About?
Music.
It was the same. I didn't put the songs.
Yeah, that was depressing. So that's it, really, I think, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much.